Welcome back to another episode of the 706 podcast, the podcast where we discuss, argue, and debate which movies are the 706 greatest movies of all time. I'm your host today, Anthony, and we are, in any order,
Connor,
Tony,
Connor,
Kirk,
Tony,
Connor.
Kirk.
classic. All right, guys, I'm calling it now. We've had about, 80, 90 episodes. And right now, E2 Mama Tambien is the fan favorite. The E2 Mama heads came out in full force. They yelled, they complained, they screamed at us. But there's nothing like Roger Rabbit fans. So the opinions today hopefully are good and hopefully are correct because they will come after you. But for those who don't know, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is the Robert Zemeckis film from 1988. Most famously known because it stars live action actors alongside famous cartoon characters, past and present. The film is essentially about a sort of noir style setup in which Bob Hoskins plays a noir detective named Valiant, who is grieving the loss of his brother and blames all Toons on his brother's death. And when he's kind of put into a situation to see if Roger Rabbit's wife is playing patty cake with someone else, a whole conspiracy gets set into motion that threatens all of Toontown and its existence. And the movie is only more famous from there. So before I get into my own opinion, I say we go around. I know Connor has seen it before, so maybe we'll have his opinion last. I don't know if this movie was new for anyone, but I say let's start with Kirk, if he's okay with that.
Sure, I'm okay with that. Thank you, Anthony, for the wonderful introduction. This movie, I don't know. It didn't draw me in as much as I guess I would have hoped it would have, given its kind of status as a classic in kind of my general wheelhouse of early 90s. What was this, late 80s? I mean, it's okay. So, it's got Christopher Lloyd. It's got that kind of, overproduced set design at times. There's not much room for nuance there. It very much got like a backlot feel, and I think obviously that's by design, not just in the scenes where it's actually on a backlot. But I don't know. I guess this comes down to a matter of personal preference. I never was a huge fan of cartoons. I always found them to be somewhat overstimulating. The physical comedy can sometimes, when it's in such great abundance, it can feel somewhat grating, especially when you're meant to watch it right as you wake up. I never understood that, like how that was supposed to work. Like Saturday morning cartoons, you're supposed to really jump into, you're waking up and you're kind of in a daze and you're supposed to be laughing right away and finding all these gags funny. The appeal never spoke to me, I guess. But the film itself, I can recognize its inherent value as kind of a media, it twists a genre. It certainly propelled the medium forward in terms of what film can do, how film can speak to large audiences, but also how it can be a dynamic and how it can be kind of this hybridization of styles and histories. And it's really an amalgam of sorts. And I think that's really cool. The issue for me is that, the beats they come too quickly. It's such a rapid succession. And there's not really much of substantive value here in terms of like a story. And I get that it's not necessarily supposed to be, you're not supposed to enjoy this film for the story. It's more supposed to be for the spectacle of it all. But, it just felt like the equivalent of like, I don't know, pouring a bowl of Pop Rocks for cereal, and like, you're left with a stomach ache. And in this case, I have a headache because of all the colors and the flashing lights, the strobing effects at times. And it's just, I don't know. I'm a little bewildered, I guess, disoriented. I would say one real kind of point of contention I have is that I don't understand why the whole Jane Jacobs, Robert Moses, urban development, urban planning spin came in at the end. I don't understand what that has to do with cartoons or animation in general, or like the spirit of animation. It just felt really bizarre as like an emotional hook, or I guess I should say like a moral arc or underpinning. Maybe it has to do with the fact that like, you know, animation brings us together. It's so loose. There are so many other things they could have pursued, like looking at how animation is the difference between maturity versus comedy versus allowing yourself to not be so self-important or self-serious at times. I was really confused by that at the end. It was interesting because like I love talking about urban planning and urban development, but you know, it just kind of felt thrown in there at the last minute. But yeah, it was fine. You know, one thing that's really impressive for me is like how the actors know where to look, of course. And so I think, you know, how they know how to respond and the timing is really, really well done, perfect in that sense. And I'm sure there's a lot that goes into that, but ultimately it is something of like a museum piece for me where I can appreciate that other people like it. I can appreciate that it's technically flawless in a sense and a marvel, but I'd rather just walk to the next piece because I wasn't quite as enthralled. I mean, I'd love to hear your opinions because, as we know, I'm very suggestible. So if you bring up some great points, my vote has not been cast yet. So even though it sounds like I always do this, so you have a shot, Anthony.
Tony, were you going to say something?
No, it was a digress. I was going to say, I was editing the Citizen Kane episode, and it's hilarious listening to your speech, Kirk, because it's so negative. You basically say, like, this movie was boring. I don't get why people like it so much. It sucks ass. Not in those words, but that was the tone. And then you're like, you know what? I'm voting it in, and I'm just like, what are you doing?
Sucks ass in the very best way.
Classic.
I'm like some Republican contingents. I may not like the candidate, but I certainly hate the other candidate more, or something like that. I go to the ballot box with my nose plugged.
Nice. I think the other classic one I always remember because it was so early on is the Beauty and the Beast episode, because you loved the movie and then voted no by the end and you were super critical of it. But anyway, so Kirk threw out some easy dismissals. Maybe we'll sway him to the other side. A lot of interesting threads: animation, the medium of it, the cross section of it, and how do we deal with it, the kind of ending with that freeway moment. Yeah, it's something to talk about, but I'll leave it there for now and go to Tony. Have you seen this before, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I watched this one, I think when I was in college, so a couple of years ago. And I remember liking it, but I didn't remember it too well. This is very common for me. I watched a lot of movies at that time, and a lot of them blend together. But I had like residual positive feelings about Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And I watched it again today for this, and it was Kirk says he's suggestible. I think I might be a little suggestible myself because I think that as he spoke, a lot of what he said kind of resonated, and that like, yeah, like there's a lot of great pieces in this movie. There's a lot of things I can admire about it, but emotionally, it doesn't like do that much for me at the end of the day. I think it's a very cool, like it's a very unique movie. It's a kind of a one of a kind movie. Although of course what it laid the foundation for would be perfected in Space Jam: A New Legacy. But that episode will be later. But no, but I mean it has a unique place in film history as kind of a technical achievement, and it is very to this day genuinely very technically impressive. I mean, Robert Zemeckis is sort of like, he has sort of a unique place where he's kind of in that, like, he's very Spielberg influenced. He's kind of in that same tradition of like kind of the big 4-quadrant Hollywood kind of spectacle, or something that kids can enjoy as well. Back to the Future and Forrest Gump to a lesser extent, which was also had a big emphasis on like the special effects, and that had its own kind of gimmick where it would insert Tom Hanks into these various historical settings and all this. And on that level, I certainly enjoy it. It's cool to see even now the way the cartoons and the people interact. And like the movie makes a point of having things like Jessica Rabbit squeezing the guy's face, stuff like that, where it's like, it's kind of like, wow, I don't know how they, even now I'm not quite sure. I'm sure I could look it up pretty easily, but I'm not quite sure how they made that look as good as it does. Or like things like, Bob Hoskins holding the cartoon gun, or the weasels holding the live action guns, which is a very simple little effect, but there is like a novelty and kind of a fun to it. I love the taxi character. The taxi character is probably my favorite character, and seeing them ride in the taxi was a lot of fun. I also love when Bob Hoskins actually visits Toontown, because we've heard about Toontown the whole movie, and then we actually see it, and it's almost like psychedelic. It's just like, it's literally all like we've gotten used to seeing the cartoons in our world, but then when you see a human being in the cartoon world, it feels so much more like weird and wrong somehow, but it's just very cool. It's very cool to see, and it's just a fun inversion. And like, things like that are what cinema is all about, or like, creating these unique images, creating these unique spectacles that we haven't seen before, and that, it is a cinematic film, and that like the things that make Who Framed Roger Rabbit special, you couldn't do in a book or a play. It has to be a film. It also has to be a film because it's so, it's so much of a pastiche, or kind of an homage to the film noir genre. And then it's almost kind of a parody of a noir. It's like a silly noir, but it's also a real noir. It hits the beats with sincerity and with confidence. And it hits them pretty well. I think it's a good screenplay. I think it's a well-written screenplay. It's well structured. Clearly the writers, I don't have the name of the writers in front of me, but clearly they have, watched a lot of film noir, and clearly can kind of play with the tropes a little bit, and I think Bob Hoskins is very fun as our main character. He's very delightful. He's like a charmingly gruff, and it strikes a good tonal balance with his kind of, he has like a dark backstory, a genuinely dark backstory. His brother was murdered, but the film is able to play that in a way that it doesn't like upset the ultimately kind of silly tone of the rest of the film. But at the end of the day, emotionally, I don't get too much out of it. I don't want to step on Anthony's toes. I know he kind of alluded last week to kind of the social commentary, or that whole urban planning kind of development at the end of the movie, where we find out, the villain's grand scheme. And yeah, like Kirk said, that didn't resonate with me too much. It felt like you're just getting that all at the end. And I don't know. I think there was just something missing for it. And I liked the cartoon aspects. I liked the fun slapstick. There's a lot of visual gags. There's a lot of inventiveness and fun in the movie. But it's not a movie that I feel like excited to watch again necessarily. I feel like I've gotten out of it what I'm going to get out of it. And it's a fun novelty, but it doesn't really transcend that for me. Though, also, as Kirk said, I'm open to being persuaded that there's something more here. So,
all right, fair, interesting take. Let's go to Connor, who picked the movie last week and had also seen it before, if I remember right.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. And yeah, I mean, I'll second what the other two said. Obviously, like the huge standout aspect of this movie is just the incredible like effects, right? Obviously, all of this is like hand-drawn animation. We talked about this in Your Name, right? The idea of like lighting and animation. This movie kind of pioneered that, in that they were extremely kind of cutting edge in the way that they were insistent on making the lighting kind of affect the animation. And they did not have any kind of digital tools to do that, like I think the creators of Your Name did. It's actually crazy how you can see, like, and they're kind of ostentatious about it. Like there's the scene where there's a lamp swinging back and forth and it lights Roger's face, and then that kind of thing. It's amazing, right? And that's the way that the kind of technical know-how and the technical precision needed to like marry these two genres, right? The cartoon and the noir. And I think that's the whole theme, and that's what the movie is so accomplished at. That's the whole pleasure of the movie. I do love old cartoons. I love like it, but it's funny when you go back and watch a lot of them, not necessarily talking like Looney Tunes necessarily, but if you go back to like 1930s animation, like the Fleischer Brothers, like the early Betty Boop cartoons and stuff, they're insane. In fact, they're not funny at all. They're really more like they're frightening. They're kind of like bewildering and frightening. And this movie has some callbacks to that era of animation. And I think like I'm never really laughing at anything that Roger or anyone other cartoon character does. It's just the contrast between him doing it and Eddie's reactions, Bob Hoskins' straight man reactions. And that's like the brilliance of taking these two genres that are completely opposed, right? But that both come from the same era and did kind of coexist, culturally, and have some of the same roots. It's like really cool to me. I think it's brilliant. And yeah, I mean, we mentioned the animation aspect, but then also I think, as Tony mentioned, I think it's the writing. I mean, the writing is so smart in this movie. I mean, it's like there's so many callbacks and developments, and obviously so many of the gags are visual, but you need to write those as well. Again, with Benny the cab, how he gets into an accident at the end, and of course his like front fender, that is his teeth, is like falling off or falling out or whatever, and then Roger drives by, then he gets into the car and drives for Roger because he's injured, so he can't drive himself. He can't move anymore, so he has to drive a car. The cab driving a car. Anyway, it's just like it's just very cool. It's very smart, witty. And I'm glad that Tony mentioned, right, just that writing, because I mean, I'm surprised no one remembers this, very famous writing duo. It's Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman, the famous duo also behind Trench Coat, Wild Wild West, and Shrek the Third. So obviously famous writers. No, and obviously I'm mentioning that. I'm surprised. I mean, I came out of this watch saying, like, what, like, oh my God, these writers are incredible. Not only kind of like the period dialogue, all of the nods to like the movies of the time, like all of these gags coming back again and again. I was really like flabbergasted. But these writers, their talent doesn't really show necessarily in these other works, and they haven't done even that much. But I thought it was just incredible, this screenplay. And I wonder too, I mean, maybe this was kind of developed in the visual aspect, in the direction and the creation of the animation. Who knows how other, jokes came into play, but I think it's so controlled and so well done. It just blows me away. And as to the thing of like, does it not like land like emotionally? Like for me, I will say that the weak part of the movie is kind of the ending. I think like we could have done more with like the Toon perspective on things. I think maybe Anthony like leaning towards like a social like reading of the Toons, and obviously there's a kind of a metaphorical aspect of the Toons who are valued as kind of entertainers, but they're also frightening and kind of marginalized, right? I mean, I think there's just like there's something very interesting about that. Obviously, it's like as a metaphor, right, as an allegory for right treatment of I think mostly Black people, right, in this country. And the studio system of the time, and also the kind of the pop culture of this like 30s, 40s era. But I don't think the movie really does anything with that, and it ends with this kind of the very interesting thing about the freeway, which does feel like almost such like a classic noir plot that I don't think is in any other noir movie. It's also in LA Noire, the game. It feels somehow so quintessentially LA, this like plot about the land development. But I don't think it was in any movie from the time. Maybe Anthony can correct me. It's kind of like Chinatown a little bit. Anyway, so like that part kind of loses me a little bit, though I love the conclusion. I'm like there with the movie. I just think there could have been more could have been done. But I think there is an emotional, like it hits emotionally for me at moments, which I hope I can get into as we go along. But I really like the movie.
All right, interesting, Connor. I like what you said, and I'm probably going to run with it in a second in terms of the LA-ness of it. I am surprised. I don't know if anyone else noticed this when they searched the movie online or happened to see it, but before I get into my own opinion, it should be said that the movie is also actually based on something. It's based on a book, which is a cult novel called Who Censored Roger Rabbit? And almost from immediately its publication, Disney saw potential here. Now, the book itself, I have not read all of it. I read 2 chapters in preparation for this podcast, and it is much darker. It's about comic strip characters in reality. It does not have the freeway plot, but it does have a kind of noir setup. And it's kind of interesting to maybe think then how the writers of Shrek 3, Trenchcoat, and Wild Wild West had something to work with. So maybe there's something there. And then Connor was saying towards the end about how this is a very specific LA movie or an LA noir. And I got to say, for my own opinion, as someone who grew up outside of LA going in, I am very serious when I say this. This is one of the great LA movies. It's one of the great LA noirs because I've never seen a movie that one gets LA in many ways so right, even if there isn't necessarily the diversity, or unless we want to interpret the tunes that way. Even if it's set in the 1940s of a pastiche world that parodies this kind of LA environment, there are just so many moments, so many callbacks, and so many hidden treasures of LA that I see pop up. The LA Bridge, the LA Aqueduct, these jokes about the streetcars, which still exists very briefly in Angel's Flight, a real place, and is a famous site for LA Noirs, and still to this day is a kind of cheap entertainment that you could still ride. But in terms of the movie itself and why I tend to like it, I'll start off and just say that look, I think there are a lot of weak aspects of this movie, and the weak points are really weak. Personally, that opening scene, which is kind of offers a parody of kind of a Tom and Jerry style cartoon, I don't find funny. I find it drags. I find Roger Rabbit himself at times is just kind of irritating. And I think this goes to say is one thing that's kind of fascinating is I don't know when Connor saw it for the first time, but the other three of us at least all saw this movie as an adult for the first time. College, Kirk, recently, and me in college. And I think that's kind of fascinating because the innuendos of the movie are innuendos, and sometimes they're funny. The patty cake to me actually made me laugh. Sometimes they just fall flat. Sometimes I wonder how a kid would watch this. And when Kirk was talking about the animation aspect, and I was someone who was into cartoons, but I have to wonder now, because Kirk brought this up during the Little Princess episode, is I wonder how kids today would really take to this movie, especially if you're used to something like CGI animation, computer, Pixar. If you're not someone who gets up on Saturday and watches 2D animated stuff, like how does this play out? Are they more into Chippendale, the recent movie that's supposedly the spiritual successor of this? I don't know. But for me, seeing all these cartoons and being a kid who loved Warner Brothers, Looney Tunes, and Betty Boop is absolutely still thrilling, and it is a nostalgic callback. But on that note, I think what we have here is one of the great postmodernist films. We are no longer able to represent our LA as we need to. We need to go in and throw in pastiche parody. And what we have, I think, is a brilliant evisceration of a real problem. The freeway that they talk about at the end of the movie is still being developed in many ways. And in fact, the freeway that they talk about to Pasadena was a real thing. Of course, I brought this up last time. Robert Towne, famous screenplay writer of Chinatown, originally envisioned a third movie in that series that took place around the freeway system. It did not happen. And instead, those elements found their way into Who Framed Roger Rabbit. And I think we get actually more hints of that ending throughout the movie than we may initially believe. The moments that are kind of jokes or one-way lines about the streetcars, Valiant riding on the back with the kids is a moment I love. And he talks about how, why would you need a car? LA has the best public transportation in the world. Ha ha. It's so true though, as this moment passes and that car's just going, and the way that LA at this moment is going to start replacing everything with freeways and highways because corporations, General Motors, the United Fund Company is about to come in with a ton of money to bulldoze what was in reality largely working class Black, Mexican, and other minority group neighborhoods to then make things like the 110 possible. So all that has its basis in reality. Now, can we give it a lot of credit because it is true? Maybe, maybe not. But I think as a movie, yes, this is a movie that gets towards the end of history. I'm sure Connor will bring up more, but I think as for the movie itself, so much has been said about the tech marvel of this, and I'm not a huge Robert Zemeckis fan. I know Tony loves the movie Flight, but for me,
Beowulf.
Beowulf. This is the peak. I think the technology is brilliant. I think it actually works in a way that serves something as opposed to just being too gimmicky. I love seeing the kind of different characters evolve, having us bring in our outside emotions to give this movie even more humor and weight and symbolism at times. I love Bob Hoskin, how straight he plays this. And I love the Valiant character. I think, anyone who's into film noir just gets so much out of that. Jessica Rabbit isn't just the kind of, online fever dream. I think, the parody of Veronica Lake and Rita Hayworth in her is just so great. And that there's just so much to offer. I think the visual gags, if they don't hit, they don't hit. But there's just so much. And I think maybe there is something to be said about how this movie is a bunch of set pieces and they work. And maybe the ending doesn't come across as strong as it should. But I think there are hints throughout the movie that kind of give it some weight. And, maybe we should just get into it. So let me start with Connor and the end of history. Or anything you want to say. You've watched this before. You were a bit more positive than the other two. Was there anything else in the movie that keeps you in or keeps you attracted to it that you didn't get to in the beginning?
I'm sure, Anthony, I can keep talking about all the good things. Well, I guess I just love, again, just back to the contrast of the two tones. I think I always, like I said, it's Bob Hoskins' reactions, right? That it comes full circle at the end, right, with himself acting like a cartoon, right? I mean, I think that is a brilliant like execution of an arc, and maybe it doesn't make you laugh like out loud, but it's kind of like it works. And in fact, here's what I like about it. For me, one of my favorite line in the whole movie is the Jessica Rabbit line. Okay, so there's two lines apparently that were taken from the book. One was, "I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way," which I don't know, it's like pretty cool, but like it doesn't make a lot of sense in the context. And then there's also this incredible line, "I've got a 50-year-old lust and a 3-year-old dinky," which is said by the Baby Herman character, which I find just like a viscerally like off-putting thing. It's like my least favorite moment in the movie. I remember watching it like, when I was younger and like being like kind of like just grossed out by it. Um, and and anyway, so but it's a Jessica Rabbit line, different Jessica Rabbit line, where it's all in the chaos of the kind of the climax. And she's like, "Well, I got to find Roger," and Eddie says like, "Well, like, what do you see in this guy?" And she says, "He makes me laugh," and that's like played like a punchline, right? But it's like it's not a punchline. It's an awe moment, right? And it's kind of the culmination of like all these things that like Roger's been saying. Like he seems to really believe this. It seems a little bit corny, but it's like that is kind of the essence, and he has had his way in a way. I don't know. I love that moment, and it's kind of like an anti-gag, right? That it makes you go awe and not like after this whole kind of in itself is about laughter. Anyway, I love that moment. That for me is kind of like the emotional core a little bit of like what really gets me with this movie. But of course, minute to minute, I love all the gags. I love the moments where things get out of control and there's so many things happening at once that I'm a little bit overwhelmed. Just because I know it's all supposed to be for fun. It's not like with Inception where I can't keep track and I feel like I have to be. But like the moment in the apartment where the weasels come in, like is a good example, like a set piece. Like there's just a lot going on at once. It's a lot of cutting back and forth. It's kind of overwhelming, but I think it's just so well executed and it's just so cool. And yeah,
Yeah, you remind me of something. So, Kirk, let me go to you and we'll get the elephant out of the room. Let's just say there are some politically incorrect by modern standards portrayals within the cartoons or the tunes. There are some interesting moments. And I think, though, before we get to that, one of the brilliant things I think the movie does, and Connor reminded me of this, is that the tunes that we have are sometimes portrayed as pretty horrible people and not always for laughs and not always for, comedic relief. And that the baby, in fact, when we kind of first encounter him after the kind of opening cartoon, it's a pretty horrible tune, right? He commits sexual harassment almost immediately from the moment we see him by flipping up the lady's skirt. He's smoking cigars and complaining to the woman about being a woman. We have other, though, awful kind of incidents that we could go on about. But how do you feel about the tunes, Kirk? And what are we supposed to do with the ones? Are we supposed to treat them as earnest metaphors for, working others? Are we supposed to just see them as comedic tunes? How do we go with this as adults thinking about this movie? Are they just cartoons for cartoons?
Well, hold that. I just wanted to respond to Connor because how movies sometimes throughout the decades they talk to each other. So Jessica Rabbit says he makes me laugh. Well, in the very famous film Ocean's 11, nominated for 28 Oscars, Danny Ocean asks Tess, who is played by Julia Roberts, about her new boyfriend Terry Benedict, played by Andy Garcia. He says, "Does he make you laugh?" And her response is, "He doesn't make me cry." And this movie, I don't know. I feel like I would be tearing up if I had to spend even 10 minutes with Roger Rabbit. But that aside, yeah, the tunes. I mean, I think they're pretty two-dimensional. You know what I mean? Just kidding. It's really hard to, where my head went was like, how did they get all these licenses? And I guess I don't know enough, right? I don't know who didn't like Panavision or something create Looney Tunes. Who created Looney Tunes? It was it Warner Brothers, right?
Warner, yeah, I think.
Yeah. So Disney and Warner Brothers like teamed up for this film. Is that what happened? I feel
There's
like
some
that's
So
story about Bugs and Mickey appearing. I don't know if you recall, Anthony. I don't remember.
I don't know the exact details. I will say this is the only time Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse have officially appeared together, along with other Looney Tunes and Disney characters. The way I understood it is, so Disney kind of did something a little typical, which was a little scummy, I guess you could say, in one hand, is that they were given licensing and a permission by Warner Brothers to actually use some of their characters. One of the rules and one of the agreements was that the characters had to have equal screen time. Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck and Donald Duck. But one of the ways that Disney also got around fully paying the Warner Brothers estate, if I remember right, or underpaid them or whatever it may be, there was certainly trouble there, is they didn't use Chuck Jones, the creator of Looney Tunes' drawings for it. They used a different animator. And because of that, they actually try to get away with possibly a little bit more with some of these characters. In terms of other things, there were characters they didn't get the permission for. Tom and Jerry's probably the most famous one, and a handful of others. I don't know if that answers your question.
sound like something Disney would do. Kidding. No, I don't know. So this medley of all these kind of memories, right? These, everybody that's watched this film that was born sometime in the 20th century has at least some sort of emotional implicit memory tied to some or all of these characters or many of these characters. So it's interesting to see that juxtaposition. It's kind of like you're thrown off. You're thrown off by the fact not only that they're alongside, human people, but that they're outside of their own canon, right? And other movies have done this. I'm thinking of what was Wreck-It Ralph. Like that's another film that kind of reminds me of this type of strategy, I guess I should say. And yeah, it's always a little disorienting. It's amusing, right? It's satisfying, right? Like you get that visceral satisfaction of seeing these characters who you never thought would, reunite or even meet in any sort of outside of some stupid fanfic online. And I think that's really cool. As far as their depth, we can see that tunes have the capacity to do evil things, whether or not, I guess they have consciousness and the ability to, and free will, but within the confines of whatever their prescripted personality is, I guess, like how they were written. I don't know. That's an interesting question, right? Like could Roger Rabbit suddenly become very serious and unfunny, just like, or is he kind of bound to that? Is he conscripted to this life? But yeah, I think there's some missteps because there's these odd moments, like the shoe being put in dip. That's a very, I mean, I can imagine, even for me, I was a little bit like, wow, they're actually going to kill the shoe. Like the shoe's not going to just like escape. Like they're going to actually do this. That's incredible. It felt like it was breaking some of the rules that we've come to understand for movies in the Disney universe or surrounds, and so that was interesting. But at the end, it just feels like they played it so safe because these cartoons are never capable of engaging in any sort of introspection that's meaningful, at least in front of us, right? So much of it is like, like callbacks or gags or set piece, right? There's nothing really like, like the idea that maybe Roger Rabbit is compensating for something with his endless and obnoxious desire to make other people laugh. Like, I mean, these things are right in front of me, and I just wonder who this movie was made for at times. So I wonder who the audience was, who it was written for. I also wonder what the intended effect was supposed to be. Maybe I'm just like, this is one of those films where you watch it and you wonder if you're just like a soulless husk, because I only laughed once. kind of, and it wasn't even like a belly laugh. It was just when Tweety Bird like picked up his fingers. That was pretty funny. But I didn't laugh at other times. I was amused, right? You kind of have that internal like ha moment. But is this supposed to be like a comedy? Is it supposed to have some emotional resonance? Or is it just supposed to be like a family friendly film with some, some adult elements that can please all audiences, right? Were they painting with a broad brush? And then I guess my final thing is I do want to come back, Anthony. I feel like you could further elucidate the connection between like animation specifically and that historical element of like, for me, why does the freeway plot belong in a movie where animated characters exist in our own reality, right? Like what's the tie-in for the metaphor that I'm missing? So I would love to hear that at some point because I might have missed it. But that's all I got.
Sure. And but before I keep going, I'll let Tony, because I feel like he was getting cut out for a second. Any thoughts on what Kirk said or anything about the movie that we've missed?
Yeah, I was thinking more kind of about what you were saying about, what are the tunes kind of supposed to represent, or like, we see, obviously the villain turns out to be a tune. And it is an odd thing, and it's like it's something that's like it's tempting to engage with on a deeper level, but at the same time it feels, I think I come away from it feeling like it feels like just a confused or kind of mixed metaphor. Because it's easy to read the tunes as terms of like as like an oppressed class, whether it be black people or the poor, or whomever, these people who are pushed out of their neighborhood and are being attacked by these systemic forces and so forth. And like that scans pretty cleanly. And in a way, it's sort of interesting to see that like you can have individual tunes doing bad things. I would normally praise that sort of thing as like sort of showing sort of a confidence and a willingness to be kind of nuanced. But it doesn't seem even that intentional. It feels more just kind of like it wasn't thought through very well. Or like I was thinking, for instance, with like, are they weasels? Is that what they are? The henchmen? Like before it's revealed that Doom is a tune, which I guess I'd forgotten somehow. I don't know how I forgot that, but when we see the weasels, and I'm thinking like, okay, you have the oppressed, joining the side of the oppressor to like, wield this weapon, the turpentine, the dip, which doesn't hurt humans, it only hurts tunes. And these tunes have no qualms about using it, and about, and that's kind of interesting, right? It's like, maybe there's a metaphor there, and like the fact, but I feel like with Doom himself being a tune, it kind of sort of unravels, especially considering the fact that Doom was a judge. This is a person in a position of power and authority in the community. It just feels like they didn't really think these things through, which is fine. It doesn't have to be a perfect metaphor, but Connor's raising his hand. As long as it's not about the end of history, let's hear it.
Not this time, Tony, but he wears a mask. And I love that. I forgot about this detail, that his face, which is to explain why he's not two-dimensional, really, right? Why Christopher Lloyd's character appears to be three-dimensional is because he's wearing like a rubber mask. So he's like, he's kind of like, he's turned his back on his Toon identity. He's like a self-hating Toon, but he uses what he knows about Toontown, right, to exploit Toontown for his own benefit and selling them out to the wider society.
Let's also add that in the early half of the movie, we learn how the judge became the judge, which is that he was a corrupt individual who used money and blackmail to become a judge in the first place. So he used the legal system of the human world to install himself, thereby getting rid of other competition and thereby making himself, with his knowledge of Toontown, someone who could legally exploit this city or this neighborhood. Does that answer your question, Tony?
Well, no, I mean, I get what you're saying, and yeah, I remember them saying he bought the election, right? And then it's like, no, I mean, it's interesting. I think it's interesting that the movie makes us have these thoughts in the first place. But I would still contend, like, I don't know if how deliberate or well constructed a metaphor it is in general, if we want to draw, that metaphor. I think it's more like they had this kind of noir plot, the idea of the freeway that happens to have some kind of social implications and economic implications and so forth, that, and that's all good stuff. That's kind of fun, and it kind of makes the movie a little bit more interesting for the adults. But I don't know if that was like from the ground up. We're like, we're gonna make a movie about the history of LA. We're gonna make a movie about what's happened to oppressed people in LA. It's more just like an incidental. It's like an extra little treat. It's like an extra little thing that the adults in the theater can be like, oh yeah, that was interesting how the villain then did this. If that makes sense, you know what I mean? Like, it's good that it's in the movie, and I think it's fine. But I don't know if it like I don't know if that's like the main appeal of the movie or something I would really sell the movie with personally.
Yeah, fair enough. I will say, as we kind of move to the voting soon, and then I'll get to Kirk's point, I will say, I think one thing to go back to something that we all talked about at the beginning, the techness of it, the tech feat of this movie. It's very easy to be like, this movie's ahead of its time, to say that about anything. But I will say, and because Kirk brought up Wreck-It Ralph, in a way, and when I say this movie's a postmodernist film and one of the great postmodernist films, I actually don't kid, because I think it's just so brilliant at doing something that Wreck-It Ralph, what was that horrible Steven Spielberg movie, Ready Player One, The Cabin in the Woods, all these kind of films are doing, is in the late 80s, it's already giving us this maximalist sense of culture in which everything's available, and it's forcing us down our throats, and it's forcing us to contend with so much at once. But I think what is brilliant about it is it grounds it down in the noir, the history of LA, and this kind of question of violence. And this is how I'll finally leave this thought here. I find it interesting that in a movie that may be for kids, maybe for adults, how easy we reckon with what violent things are happening. Kirk could question the shoe, but we also see multiple human people shot or killed or talked about being horribly like treated to. Blackmail is one thing. The way what we hear how the cops are horrible to other non-tuned people and to the tunes, how easy the sense of like anti-tuneness runs through people. It all kind of, I find very fascinating. And I'll kind of turn that into the final thought is, Kirk, when you hear the plan for that Pasadena freeway, we do see little scatters of it throughout the movie in other places. Of course, as I said before, it's based on reality and what was actually happening. Of course, the freeway that they talk about was envisioned in the 40s and is still not even complete in the late 2000s, but is finally done by the first decade of the 2000s. Kirk, you now know of it as the 210. It is the initial freeway, though, built that goes not only from LA to Pasadena, but Pasadena past into the Inland Empire. It's a very interesting kind of anecdote. But I do think that while the metaphor isn't necessarily always neat, that there's a number of different threads that I do find more intentional. I don't know if it's there in the screenplay. I'm not saying Robert Zemeckis is the guy who's literally saying this tune is that. But I find it comes up, and I find it comes up not only because of the movie or because of its history, but because of the way things are brought together, human and tune, tune and tune, and human. So that's kind of that. All right. Well, I guess we can move on to the voting. I say we do it in an interesting order. Let's throw Kirk up first.
I do appreciate going first because there's still a chance it can get in, but I have to say no. I don't know. Maybe I'm being a stickler, but this movie took such great risks, and that's amazing. And I hear what you're saying about kind of there's so many readings here that we're not even considering, and they might be incredibly profound. And they might work in like as a backdrop to a what's his name?
Adam Curtis.
Yeah, like an Adam Curtis. Like this could be in the background, right? Little did they know, it was all fake. But just for me, like with that great risk, you take on so much responsibility, and I feel like you only get one real shot to make this work because a film like this is not going to be made again, and so. The moment to moment dialogue's great. The gags are great, but the story, right? It doesn't land for me. I don't think the potential was fully explored, and it felt a little disjointed. As disjointed as perhaps the visuals are, I feel the story suffers from the same fate, but it's less amusing than the visuals are. So I will say no, but respectfully, I respect, Anthony, your choice here and your defense of it.
All right, yeah, thanks, Kirk. Does anyone remember if this movie pops up and LA plays itself? Like at all? Like a scene or two?
I thought it did.
We've got the greatest public transportation system in the world. I think that does appear in it.
Okay, I think I remember. Yeah, I'm trying to remember that other documentarian we like. And by the way, before I forget this, I think it's fascinating, Kirk. The movie had a high budget at the time. You know, this is 50 million in the 1980s money. It made $350 million at the box office. And I don't know if that's just Disney marketing bringing people in at the time or like if how audiences really reacted to it. I'd have to look and ask around, but yeah, I just thought that was kind of interesting. So we'll let Tony go if he's ready.
Yeah, no, I'll go. Yeah, I mean, I have kind of similar feelings to Kirk. I think, I mean, if we were doing a podcast where it was just like the canonical, American films of the 20th century or whatever, I think this would have to be on there. It's an important film. It's a technological landmark. It's cool for a lot of the reasons you guys have pointed out. I think that conceptually the movie is very cool. I think it was well executed. I think anyone who hasn't seen it should see it at some point. But just going purely off of my own subjective enjoyment of the movie, and like I didn't find it especially funny. I chuckled a couple times. I did find Roger Rabbit himself pretty annoying and so forth. Things like this that grated on me a little bit. Even though I enjoyed the movie on the whole, I have to go like a soft no. That's just what my gut is telling me. But it is a soft no. I do respect this movie and like it generally.
All right, fair enough. Well, Connor, unless Kirk or Tony run and demand to switch their vote in the next minute, your vote's largely symbolic. But how do you feel?
I'm gonna make my voice heard. Yeah, it's definitely a yes for me. I just wanted to say that I don't think it's like completely perfect as regards like if we think about this as like a metaphor, and I think like we definitely can, and it really struck me this time that you really can read it as like a metaphor. Obviously, there's like an aspect of that's a little bit like uncomfortable and cringe, like to have to talk about like real social issues, like allegorically when there are like, people of color appear in the film as humans. So like, what does that mean in this world? Like, it's just like, this is kind of like, obviously it's like a little uncomfortable and kind of weird. But if you're willing to kind of entertain the idea, I think like it is really all there. And, I think they could have taken it a little bit farther. I think ultimately where we can kind of come down with like a reading is, like when Judge Doom gives his like speech about like it'll be beautiful, like all the freeways and miles of concrete and fast food stores, right? And it's like the idea is like we're supposed to like get this like dark vision of our present, right? Our kind of barren present. And what's that being contrasted with? Well, with the 1940s when things were so much better. Is that quite accurate? But there is that sense of kind of like a longing and maybe the sense of like obviously what was lost, in the creation of the freeways, creation of a more like diverse and vibrant LA, right? And that again too is kind of like vibrant, is like colorful, maybe like that. These are kind of like the metaphors. These are the things that the tunes are standing in for. I mean, I think that's like a little bit like problematic in a way if you like want to read it into that. I'm not saying you are, Anthony, but that's kind of the reading I take away from it. I think is there, but I just think it doesn't quite go there, especially because as Kirk mentioned, like you don't get like the subjectivity of like the tunes in the same way. We have like the Baby Herman who's like the really like who's the one who's like very conscious of like tune issues. Like he's keeping track of everything and he knows how they're getting screwed, at any given turn. But we don't like Baby Herman for other reasons. So, anyway, I think it's awesome. Another thing I would say is just like comparing it to Ready Player One or whatever, like the references, the idea of like seeing things. And what I love about this movie is like, it's not like references. It's not just like, oh, there's Dumbo. I remember Dumbo. Oh, there's the things from the brooms for Fantasia. I remember that. It's like the fact that it is calling upon that whole universe of cartoons, which has kind of its own like predictable rules and logic, as you've seen from having seen a lot of cartoons, right? Like that, the shave and a haircut thing. Have you ever seen that in a cartoon? No, but it feels plausible somehow, right? It's not a reference. It's satire, it's parody, or it's reference. It's not reference, but it's it's just drawing on that whole world and that whole logic. And I think there's something more to be said about that, but I think it's very cool. Anyway, I really like this movie. I give it a yes.
All right, thanks, Connor. I'll just say one final thought because I forgot it till now. There was a great internet moment, typical internet moment about 10 years ago when Detroit was really trying to push its like gentrification and like tech cityness. There was a moment, and if we remember at the end of Roger Rabbit, where he says no one will see like the devastation of Toontown when you're driving 75 miles an hour and you're speeding along or whatever it is. There's a great moment in the developers of Detroit when they were trying to attract people. They were saying they built walls along their freeway and their highway system. They were like, so you will never notice the trouble. And it became such an internet phenomenon to just parallel these two things, Roger Rabbit in that like real life moment, which is kind of an interesting little side anecdote. But Roger Rabbit tried, did not get in. It was an interesting watch, I hope. But we'll move on to the fan favorite section, in which these three nominate a movie, and they claim a decade that another can't use, and I decide what we watch for the next week. So I think Tony was least recent, maybe.
So, all right. I'll have Connor go first, and then I'll go second.
All right, Connor.
I mean, damn it, Tony. I've been rapidly looking. I always do. I always forget to pick my movie in advance, but I've got one. This is a unique film, I think, in its genre, with a unique tone. This is Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, starring Gary Oldman, a spy film based on the Le Carré novel, which I think had been adapted before into a TV series. Anyway, but it's a movie that is unique in its like tone, capturing the Le Carré ethos of spying, right, which is the exact opposite of James Bond, and is based on some real kind of insights of what spying was like in the aftermath of World War II, right, during the Cold War, and it's kind of bleak, and it is very dour, and it is very British. And it is just a very interesting movie that I think we could all react to. I think it would be strong. I'd be very curious to see, like, would it come across as boring, or would it still have a kind of like, would we find like elements of it? Because I remember the first time I watched it, I found it boring, but then I think on a second watch I really liked it. So I'm curious how we'd like come down on Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
All right, interesting. So I think that was the 2010s, right? So I guess Tony, you're at that.
Down. Let me make sure. I think it's 20.
It was 2011. I just looked it up. It's funny. I just gave it to Connor first, and having a movie in mind, which was a terrible mistake because he took my decade. So I completely waived any advantage that I would have had. So that's
finally happened. That was the whole point of this wrinkle for the listeners, to have these moments. So now Tony's scrambling. He got whammied.
Call me an egg because I'm scrambling. But obviously the 2010s are the only good movie decade. I mean, this is something I've discovered in my life. Those are the only movies worth watching were made between, whatever years.
Exactly when I was in college, yeah.
Well, the college age, exactly. It's like everyone listens to music from like when they were in high school and thinks that's the best time for music. That's okay though. I'll find something else. So I think what I'm going to go with instead is
Mishima?
You know what, Anthony? Just because you said it, why not? I'm pitching Mishima again. I wasn't going to, but I'm just going to. Why not? I was thinking about it the other day, and you know what? I just gotta we gotta try. We gotta try and do it. Mishima by Paul Schrader, which is from the 80s. I'm pretty sure. Mishima, Life in Four. Yeah, 1985. Okay, so Kirk's two favorite decades have been eliminated. This is a biopic of sorts about the Japanese author Yukio Mishima. And it was written and directed by Paul Schrader, famous screenwriter of Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and so forth. More recently, he's directed First Reformed and The Card Counter and some other films. Very interesting kind of cinematic persona who I feel a sort of kinship with. I feel sort of drawn to. A very interesting guy with very particular fixations, makes a lot of movies about kind of lonely men that become obsessed with something, become obsessed and driven with something. And this movie is no obsession, no exception. I'm talking like one of the tunes with the malapropisms. And yeah, it's one of my favorite movies, I would say. Very colorful, very beautiful, very unconventional biopic. And very emotionally intense, I find. So that is my pitch for this week.
Tony has that like down at this point. That whole summary and explanation of the film. Very bold choice. I was not expecting it. Kirk, what do you got for us?
So I have to ask how we're defining the decades. We never.
We've been doing it. No, we have established. We start 0 through 9.
2000.
Fuck. All right, fair enough. Fair play. I wanted to do 2010. That'll wait. Let me see here.
The only good decade for movies.
Yeah.
Hoisted by Don Petard.
Connor really scrambled the group.
Yeah. I mean, if Tony's doing repeats, I'll do a repeat. I think this was a little while back, but I really think we should watch another round. It's the Vinterberg, isn't it? I'm so ill prepared because I was scrambled. Who is it? Yeah, it's Thomas Vinterberg, Danish, right? Yeah. And he's good friends with Mads Mikkelsen. And they made this film that is incredibly harrowing. It's a great mix of emotions, really. It's entertaining. It's comedic. It's like almost has these like bro film moments, but it's through a foreign lens. So it feels fresh, at least for me. And then it really, really does talk about, it comes to terms or it has a nice little thing to say about, the frailty of youth, but in a very innovative and insightful and kind of a way that you don't normally see these issues talked about. I should say that. It almost makes me feel like the Danish have this, they're keyed into some of these psychological concepts in a way that us Americans are not. He's director of The Hunt, so this would be our second Vinterberg film. It's just really his only other film of note. Came out in 2021, I want to say. Oh no, 2020. So there we go. 2 years ago, very recent. But if any of you haven't seen it, especially, I'm not sure any of you have seen it, but there's great musical piece at the end, kind of very iconic, great movie.
All right, interesting. Connor scrambled everybody. Some last minute choices, some bold choices, some foreign choices. I need to hear something. So, Connor, what do you have to say for your film?
So I'm sorry for the last minute choice. I kind of am glad that I scrambled everyone. I forgot even the director of my film. It is Thomas Alfredson, who did Let the Right One In. I wasn't even really aware. I mean, this movie kind of stands out. You kind of see the connection. Obviously, very unique tone, and of course, it makes a lot of very distinct, like cinematic choices that I think we could reflect on, while also being, a reflection of the novel. What made me think of it was the gag in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, where we see a headline that says "Goofy cleared of all spy charges." I love to imagine that Goofy was either like suspected of being a Nazi or a communist spy. I mean, I love that idea. Very interesting film. And I have nothing really to say against the other two. Mishima, I have actually read. Unlike Tony, I have read a book by Mishima, so I'm going to get very.
I'm reading that book right now, Connor.
Oh,
excellent. Any recommendations? So I hopefully I'll be done by the time we do it. If we do it,
of course, and as Tony would point out, that it's a bit of a separate issue of Mishima, the person and the writer, Mishima, the kind of the figure, and obviously different than Schrader, the director, and the movie itself, right? So I was looking forward to bringing showing off my having read a book, but now Tony's going to upstage me, I guess. And I do really want to see another round as well. It's been on my list. I've come like this close to watching it. In fact, when it was eliminated last time, I'm like, I better watch it because like we might not get to see it again. But here is another chance. And I did not watch it, so I have nothing to say against it.
Yeah. Are you guys reading Spring Snow?
Oh, A Temple of a Golden Pavilion or something of the Golden Pavilion.
Yeah, I have Spring Snow. I think it was like one of David Bowie's favorites, so I think that's why I picked it up from the sellers outside. But okay, interesting. Tony, you've nominated Mishima, I feel like dozens of times. You've cried.
I nominate it every single week. So I've never hosted an episode, and I think it's 80 episodes now. It's about time. I've actually seen both of the other movies and don't love either of them. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. I think I saw around the time I saw Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It was like the same period of my life, and it left me very cold, which is the point, right? Supposed to feel cold, but I was just cold. I was chilly. I needed a blanket. I don't know. I felt bewildered by it. Definitely one though that I was like, I got to give this another shot at some point. So a lot of people love it. So maybe this will be the time. I don't know. And another round, I went in with really high expectations, and I liked The Hunt a good bit better. There were just things about another round that didn't really work for me that much, and I won't get into specifics, but yeah, just, I mean, there are certainly, it's still worth seeing, and there's some great stuff in it, but it just didn't hit me the way I was kind of hoping it would, the way it did for Kirk. And I don't know. I mean, what else can I really say about Mishima? I mean, I just think it's tailor-made for the podcast. I think Paul Schrader is a figure we need to introduce. We need to bring him onto the cast of characters, even if we don't end up doing this one. Do at least one of his films. I think he's like a really fascinating artist in the world of cinema, and an important one. And I think this is the perfect marriage of like subject matter and director. And it makes a lot of really bold and wonderful aesthetic choices. But yeah, that's my pitch.
All right, thanks, Tony. And we'll go to Kirk for another round.
All right. Anthony, have you seen the film?
I haven't.
Okay.
I haven't seen any of these.
So it actually might be an advantage that Tony doesn't like the film. I mean, let's be honest. But no, another round. It's about this group of teachers in Denmark who are they're all really kind of just, they have subsistence existences. Like they're just kind of doing the minimum. They're in unhappy marriages or kind of middling marriages, but they cope with alcohol and friendship, right? And one day they read some stupid study that said that if you were to, the optimal personality is for humans is when they have a blood alcohol content of like 0.5 or something, 0.05, not 0.5, 0.05. And so they all decide to like drink continuously, and then things obviously go off the rail in their personal lives. And I think the one thing that you'll really love is you get to see Mads Mikkelsen as older man. Like he's aged. I mean, he's here for a good time, not a long time, I guess. I think he enjoys his spirits and still smokes. And I don't know. It's just, you look at him in this film and then you think back to when like Casino Royale came out. Like that was the first film I ever saw him in. And it's just stark contrast. So that only feeds into the narrative of like, having these moments pass you by and being almost toxically nostalgic for a certain part of your life that's now gone, and coming to terms with where your life is now and what that means and what's expected of you by society. These are all very Kirk topics, if you haven't guessed already. But it's well directed, and there are certainly some creative choices. As far as Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the thing that stands out to me most from that film, and I don't remember it that well, is Colin Firth's performance. And then as well as La Mer, this playing over this really great montage at the end of the film. That was pretty cool. Pretty stark contrast there. And then Mishima, I don't know. If Tony's reading a Mishima book, I might have to stay off his WordPress for a while. So we'll just I don't know what maybe we should take the knives away from Tony for a while, or do a safety assessment. But
in my defense, Connor implored me to read it. I was not on my radar. You have to read this specific book by him, and I'm like, all right, I'll give it a shot.
Well, there's differential sensitivity. Connor may enjoy it. Tony may start to believe it. That's the difference.
Connor can handle it, but I can't. That's true. Fair enough.
All right. Fair enough. Let's see. Each of these movies have their own temptations, I think. For Tony, I'm kind of tempted towards it just because of how many times he's really pushed for this like being a podcast movie. My thing about it though is like I don't know why, just nothing about Mishima sounds appealing. And like Paul Schrader, I think I've said this before, is like a director I just can't get behind. I just find him like really like boring in like an academic in like the worst ways. I love American Gigolo, maybe that's the exception. Uh for Kirk, Winterberg would have a lot to follow up to. The Hunt was a thought provoker. I do like the idea of Mads Mikkelsen, seeing him older, seeing him act that way. He's always great to watch. Similar to Connor, I've had that movie like, ready to play and I just never pulled the trigger. Maybe it's the movie I need in my life right now, but I don't know. And then Connor's film, I like love a good spy movie. I haven't seen it. And at the same time, like hearing the kind of mid enthusiasm from the other two, though, kind of leaves me a little hesitant. So what the hell? I'll do Mishima. I'll give Tony his shot. Maybe we'll all talk about the Mishima books we've read. So Kirk, start reading.
To all our valued listeners, if there's ever a time to catch up on Love Island with your girlfriend, it might be our next episode. Because, I guess no need to take an Ambien next week. Because we'll have Tony's intro about how he's a troubled male on an island, surrounded by foes. I don't know. I have no idea. Maybe I'll love Mishima. But
do you know like what is about his life and stuff, Kirk? I won't say anything if you don't. Do you know the basic story at all? Okay, no. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay,
we'll see.
great.
We'll see. I mean, I think I did know, but it sounded so uninteresting that I forgot intentionally. I have to make space for other more intriguing thoughts.
Fair enough. Well, you can forget it again. If you forgot it once, you can forget it again after next time. So
we're about to have 2 Mishima converts to his life. So anyway, I'll have what she's having.